Chappelle, all right, good job today in class. I know that this stuff is not the most riveting information on the planet. Honestly, the Middle Ages is not the most riveting thing on the planet, but it's one of those things that we just kind of grind through, right? Because the next unit with the Renaissance period is going to make so much more sense if you understand the growth and kind of reset period that was the Western Middle Ages, right? Or the medieval era. So when we were in class today, though, we left off talking about the growth of the Catholic Church power and how that's going to kind of come into conflict with nobility, king or monarchical power as well, right? So we talked about how the church, the king, and the nobles are three reigning different people that kind of rule over the common day people of Europe, right? The nobles directly affect the lives of the people. The kings affect the lives of the nobles. The popes are trying to affect the lives of the kings and the nobles, right? So interestingly enough, though, we talked a little bit also about papal supremacy, right? So papal supremacy was the power that some popes, particularly corrupt popes during the Middle Ages, were actually trying to use to their advantage to exert their power over top of other kings, like big, strong ones that were coming up in England and France, right? So the Pope and the Church thought that they were the supreme power over all these other people because they were the ones that can teach, preach, and translate biblical texts, right? Now, really quick, I just use a couple of important things. Preach, teach, translate. You can't really understand papal supremacy and the growth of the church as a political figure during the medieval period until you actually kind of understand the medieval Catholic Church in total, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a step back and we're going to talk about the medieval Catholic Church in its essence, in its totality, right? So there are some things we already know, and I'll let you know whenever we get to the things that you don't necessarily already know. So for example, who leads the Catholic Church during this time period and during the current time period? That of the Pope, right? So we know the Pope is the supreme head of the church, and he is the top of the Catholic Church hierarchy, right? Now, another question is, though, are there other leaders as well? There are, and we talked about those a little bit in class, right? You know that there are priests, cardinals, bishops. There is a giant hierarchy going all the way down to the priest that exists inside of a parish that everything in the Catholic Church is related to, right? And of course, that includes also the nuns and also the convents and the monasteries and all these other things. But what we're looking at is the simplistic view of the medieval Catholic Church during the medieval time period and how it affected the lives of everyday people as well as the political leading figures of this time period, right? So going further, though, we also know that there are figures or icons and other kinds of stories that are really, really of heavy use in the Catholic faith, right? So, and that being of the saints, right? So we know that saints are a heavy part of Catholic heraldry and Catholic history, actually showing martyrs and different figures. And I know for a fact that y'all talked about some of these guys in Mr. Mathern's class, right? For example, St. Thomas, right, is the one that apparently touched the wounds of Christ, right? And then we have St. Bartholomew, who was a martyr, who was flayed alive, and we'll talk about both those guys in the next unit when we get to the Renaissance piece, because a lot of them show up in some of these artworks. And another famous saint, is that of St. Patrick, right? St. Patrick, as in St. Patrick's Day, heavily celebrated in Ireland and culturally diffused into the Americas during the 1800s, due to the fact that St. Patrick apparently was the Catholic saint that drove the snakes out of Ireland. And now, more than likely, snakes were not actually snakes. Snakes are much more than likely paganism and converted the Irish Celts to Christianity. Now, going into that, if you ever actually look into the Bible, the snake is actually used as a heavy symbol of the devil or of evil. Actually, many, many statues of Mary have her standing on top of the snake, right? So, but interesting figures the saints are, and this is also mind-blowing. You should write this down real quick because this is definitely going to be one of those little things that I want to see if you remember on the test. You know how many saints there are in the Catholic Church as of modern era? Over 10,000, right? There are 10,000 different saints. There are saints for everything. My favorite is Saint Roch because he's the patron saint of dogs. So now, really quick though, how often do people go to church? Now, this is where we're getting into the stuff that you probably don't already know, right? This is the stuff that's really, really important. That's going to kind of change your mindset and make you understand that the medieval Catholic Church is very different from the current Catholic Church. The faith is still fantastic. But people are going to mess it up in the medieval period and kind of use it for all the wrong reasons. And they use it for all the wrong reasons by taking advantage of a populace of people that are very dedicated and pious, right? So how often do people go to church in the Middle Ages? Every single day. Sometimes 2 to 3 times a day, right? Multiple times for reconciliation every single day, confession, prayer, meditation, things like that, and would oftentimes attend like a morning mass every single day, right? So middle-aged Catholics, as we can tell by looking at this, are extremely pious, right? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that imagine your life during the Middle Ages. It's not a very good one. Disease could pop up at any time. You're barely subsistence farming, right? You could starve to death at any moment. So remaining pious and like for the ultimate salvation is a very, very important to middle-aged individuals, right? So every day, church, 2 to 3 times a day. And this is another very important aspect of the medieval Catholic Church during this time period. What language do you think the Bible was only written in? Good job, Kelsey. I heard you over there. Latin, right? So it's only written in Latin. Why is it only written in Latin? Because the first texts of the Bible were written in Latin. Why were the first texts of the Bible written in Latin? Because Christianity was legalized during the Roman Empire before it fell, right? So very, very important concept that we understand. It's exactly why on y'all's Chipping Day like sweatshirts you're wearing, Deus Providebit, because that is Latin for God will provide, right? One of the original texts of the Bible, of course, right? So texts of the Bible were all written in Latin. No vernacular Bibles, and we'll talk about vernacular Bibles a little bit later on, especially when we get to the Renaissance. We start talking about vernacular literature, right? So what we're going to do with the medieval Catholic Church, though, is we're going to hone in on it a little bit, and then we're going to expand out, right? So we're going to start with the smallest version of the Catholic Church that you would interact with every single day, and it's the village church, right? So when we looked at this picture of the manor system at the beginning of the last lesson, we've got the manor up here, the serf-like dwellings right here, the vassals would have lived on the outskirts out here protecting the entire area, and as you know, the king exists completely separate from all this, right? This whole thing right here, do not forget, is a fief, very, very important word, fief, F-I-E-F, the entire plot of land is a fief, but remember, every single manor had a church on it, right? And so villages would actually exist on these like areas of land, and during the Middle Ages, the village church was a central focal point of your life. This right here is an actual, is an actual medieval church that was built during the Middle Ages, and this one is in Surrey, England, right? So as you can see, simple, modest construction, not very large, only meant to house a few, maybe 100 people at a time, right? So now, but every single church was ran by a parish priest, right? Like Father Andrew is for us, okay? So like a parish priest is your go-to central figure that you would go and actually have mass served to you every single day. Now, interesting things about this parish priest, though, is they would operate completely different than that of parish priests now. So if you look at Father Andrew now, in the modern era, he delivers his homily in English, a vernacular language that we can understand. He says a few things in Latin, but it's actually usually not aloud or to the crowd, right? And also, he faces towards you, right? He looks at you, and he actually serves Mass to the group of people in the congregation. In the medieval Catholic Church, he would have been turned around the entire time and speaking in complete Latin the entire time, so nobody in the Mass would have even been able to understand him. Now, this is going to lead to some stuff later on, but it's just important that you know that even Mass was so different during the Middle Ages, right? So the parish priest, though, in the village church were of massive importance, mainly because that is the place you went to receive your very important, all-important sacraments, right? So the sacraments, as you've already talked about in religion, as you already know, there are 7 of them, right? I can never remember all of them, but I know some of the big ones are marriage, baptism, and confession, right? Now, I know burial isn't necessarily a sacrament on that list, but in the medieval era, burial at a church on a holy ground was considered the only way into heaven, so basically it was considered a sacrament in and of itself, right? So marriage marked your entry as a Catholic union into a community, right? Your baptism marked your entry from your birth into the Catholic community. And also the other really, really big one, the very, very all-important one, was the host, right? The Eucharist, or the taking of communion, okay? So without doing these sacraments, it was believed in the medieval Catholic era that you would not be able to receive salvation whatsoever, right? Which is another big reason why everybody went to church 2 to 3 times a day, right? So another thing about the host in general when it comes to the medieval Catholic Church is the concept of transubstantiation, right? So during the medieval era, you're going to see the rise of a concept or an idea of transubstantiation. What transubstantiation is, which is one of my favorite words to say, is the idea that the host itself, that piece of bread turns into a piece of Christ upon it being blessed by the priest and then actually ingested by the person, right? That it turns into a physical piece of the body, right? And the wine turns into the physical blood of Christ, okay? So this transformation or transubstantiation is the conversion of that bread into Christ using a priest as the conduit, right? So understanding that Catholics during the medieval era believed that the priest had to be there to actually bless that bread, to make it holy, is very important when we get to the Reformation a little bit later on, right? So another huge part, though, about the village church is this concept right here, and you should definitely highlight that word, right? The paying of the tithe, okay? So every single Sunday, when you would go to Sunday Mass in these medieval Catholic churches, you were expected, albeit required, to pay this thing known as the tithe, right? So the tithe was a 10% donation, or like basically a mandatory donation to the church, so the church could operate and actually function appropriately, right? So 10% of your income. So let's say hypothetically I made $100 in a week. I'd have to give $10 of my money to the church in the form of that tithe, right? So that is going to become really, really important, because over time, during the medieval era, the tithes, 10%, they were taking 10% of a smaller number, right? Nobles were only making X amount of dollars, right? But as time progresses and economies begin to boom, the 10% number stays the same. So the amount of money they start collecting is a lot more, right? So that is going to become a very, very important thing as well, because the medieval Catholic Church had all the right reasons and all the right foundations, but as time progressed, things are going to get a little sketchy, right? So now, even dealing out justice was considered a big thing. Your literal priest and your church in the medieval Catholic era was the place you took criminals to receive justice, right? Because they didn't have a lot of local magistrates or judges or juries or things like that, because they were so spread out, and the medieval era lacked any kind of very, very major Roman-style ideas and very, very intrinsic ideas like that, right? So even if hypothetically, let's say that Remy Marshall, right, violated some kind of law, she stole bread from another family, right? So apparently she would receive her justice there. Sometimes these justices were in the forms of these things known as ordeals, right? An ordeal was basically a punishment under this system to see if the person was truly wrong or not, or to see if they were truly, like, unpure or not. For example, ordeals included having to walk across hot coals and burn the bottoms of your feet, having to hold a red hot iron to see if it burned your skin, right? And if it didn't burn you, you were innocent. And if it did burn you, then you were guilty, right? So, like, it's not a great system, but basically, in a nutshell, your parish priests and your parishes were also even these places where you got punishment doled upon you. But it also is a place for celebrations, so holidays and other big moments happen there as well.
Please let me say hi.
I have so much going on.
Please. Is it recording or no?
Yes, it's recording. You're
Oh,
right
hi. That's it. That's all I wanted.
So the village church was extremely important, right? But then we move into these cities, right? These really, really big urban areas, these urban cities in places like Paris, London, major cities, Barcelona, Madrid, of the Middle Ages that are beginning to be established and beginning to expand. You start to see the growth of these things called cathedrals, right? So cathedrals were much larger churches ran by bishops that were affiliated with the Catholic Church, right? Now, the really all-important thing about medieval Catholic churches and like actually these cathedrals in general has to do with their construction and their architecture, right? Their architecture has like a seminal idea behind it that kind of exudes medieval culture, right? And what that architecture is called is Gothic architecture. So here's what you're going to need to do. We are going to be extra academic right now, like we always are in this class, and we are going to keep getting you ready for college. So I do not have words on this screen, but I am going to show you some pictures of Gothic architecture, and I'm going to give you 5 bullet points to write down, okay? You'll need to know at least 3 of them for your test, so let's go ahead and jot these things down. So really quick in your notes, just put elements of Gothic architecture, right? And then bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. And I'm going to try and move through this quickly so I don't try to make this like flip too long, right? So looking at this entire element, looking at all these things, these churches were massive, right? And this one is the most famous one, right? That right there is the most famous cathedral that actually is built in Gothic style architecture. It was started construction in the 1200s. It is in Paris. It is that of Notre Dame, right? Notre Dame. It is not Notre Dame. Notre Dame is like the Fighting Irish, right? But Notre Dame is a very all-important place because it's even made appearances in Disney movies. Exactly. Y'all know Quasimodo, the saddest Disney movie that's ever existed. Ever. All right, so anyway, because like, hey, goofy dude, you don't get to be with a pretty girl. Anyway, don't get me started. Now, anyway, looking at this entire thing, though, that right there is Notre Dame in Paris, which is a great symbol of Gothic architecture. This over here is a great symbol of Gothic architecture. That is St. Stephen's Cathedral in Austria. So as you can see, there are tons of these things spread out all over Europe. That's me in Austria with my wife. She's cute. I don't know how to smile for pictures. We already know this, right? So looking at these two like places back to back, you can see a couple of common elements about Gothic architecture already, right? So let's start off with the easy ones. One, it is built out of a universal stone or concrete construction, right? So that is why you have this kind of gray sandstone exterior, right? So universal stone construction or stone construction throughout, whatever you really want to put in your notes, just to kind of delineate the fact that it's made out of the same kind of rock, right? It's not brick, it's not mortar, it's used out of like usually sometimes poured concrete and or other cut stones that they've actually stacked on top of each other. So this stuff right here gives it a very kind of darker element and look to the outside. Now, a way to add color that they used was actually by adding these. You see how these windows are on the outside? Those windows are a very particular type of window. They're called stained glass windows, right? Stained glass windows. Very, very important. You've seen them in your churches before. They add a huge amount of color and a very large amount of light to the interior area of the church. But stained glass windows actually started their construction and their development during the medieval era and as a part of Gothic architecture, right? Now, another big thing about those windows is this type of window. And you can put this next to stained glass windows. This right here, that's a rose window, okay? So rose windows were the really, really round stained glass windows that provided a heavy amount of light, usually up towards the pulpit where the priest was. So rose windows is another element of Gothic architecture. And as you can see by looking at this Notre Dame picture, by looking at St. Stephen's picture, this one is a St. Stephen's picture as well. There's one really universal common element to all these images. Everything in Gothic architecture comes to a point, right? So everything does. As you can see, the spires, the windows, even parts of the rose windows, all these different elements come to a very sharp edge, okay? So Gothic architecture, everything comes to a point. So we've already got, so far, we've got universal stone construction, stained glass and rose windows. Everything's coming to a point. So all these different elements are super, super important. This is another very important one as well, vaulted ceilings. So when we look inside of this picture or inside of St. Stephen's Cathedral, you can see the stained glass windows right there in the back. And also the ceilings are super, super high and very, very elevated without any internal support structure. So look at the size of this man right here, right? This is a picture that I took. He has no idea that he's in my photos, which is a very weird thing when you think about being on vacation. But inside of this church, look how tall the ceiling is by comparison to him. It's a very, very, very large area, great acoustics, but how do you think middle-aged architects, who some probably didn't know how to read and write, well, actually the architects probably did, but many people in the Middle Ages didn't know how to read and write, how was it possible that they were able to pull off an architectural phenom like these vaulted ceilings? They actually used a really important piece of Gothic architecture known as these. This is super important. Jot this down. Flying buttresses, okay? Flying buttresses. F-L-Y-I-N-G, like flying, and buttresses, B-U-T-T-R-E-S-S-E-S, okay? Flying buttresses are stone columns, rafters, or pillars that are on the outside of the church that holds the roof up from the outside rather than rafters on the inside. Like if you were in my classroom right now and we took the drop ceiling away, you'd be able to see rafters on the inside of the building, right? Because that is where the actual brunt of the roof is being held up. In Gothic architecture, it's held up on the outside of the building using these flying buttresses, right? So that's another huge element. And last but very not least, this guy right here, that's a huge element of Gothic architecture, gargoyles, right? Gargoyles were ornamentations used on the outside of Gothic architecture, trying to use to be scare away evil spirits and things like that, right? So gargoyles were another very, very famous piece of Gothic architecture. So going forward, though, as we begin to kind of understand that not only is the village church in your life, not only is the cathedral in your life, but the church is everywhere in society. So how does it affect other people in society? That's not maybe just the men, or maybe not just other faiths or whatever. So the views on women are very, very important. When we look at the Catholic Church's views on women, they are seen as equal before the eyes of God, right? So that's as in when they are souls ascend to heaven, those souls are seen as equal. However, on earth, women began to be viewed as very, very weak and easily led to sin, right? Ooh. This is what kind of leads to the adoption of a lot of really, really messed up systems inside of Europe during this time period, right? So particularly that of young female marriage, right? So most women by your age would have already been married because it was believed that a man needed to guide them through life, right? Because they were so weak and easily led to sin. Also, remember, this is the middle-aged Catholic Church. The current Catholic Church does not believe this at all. So they were also taught to try and embody the practices of Mary through practice and prayer. And again, remember, how old was Mary when she gave birth to Christ? So they started making these weird relations, right? Now, another really important thing, though, is that speaking of justice in the village church, right, the ordeal, Remy's got to hold that hot iron, right, to prove that she's not guilty of her crime. So, but understanding this whole thing, there were important things that a village church would do. Apparently, they would help protect women from like abusive husbands and things like that. So it is important that the village church that the village church did try to regulate violence towards women, but it's still kind of messed up that they were viewed as like weak and easily led to sin. Right now, another big thing about this is their views on other faiths. Right, so the Catholic Church during this time period was not necessarily the most accepting of other faiths, right? Now, we will talk about this a little bit later on, but a lot of this has to do with the motivations of men, right? The Catholic faith is accepting of other people, but certain popes and certain kings and certain nobles start trying to use the Catholic Church to their advantage to go start wars with other faiths. Like, for example, one right here named Charles Martel, that is actually Charlemagne's grandfather, right? So Charlemagne, like Carolingian, like Carlos Magnus, Charles the Great that we talked about in the last flip, that's his grandfather, and he got this nickname called the Hammer because he actually apparently, went to war with the Muslims who were in southern Spain and pushed them all the way down into the middle of Spain, right? As in the hammer of the Muslims, right? So he used Catholicism as his motivation for that, right? As in, I'm driving away not the infidels, but the Saxons and the savages away from us because they don't worship like Christ. That's not the Catholic Church telling him to do this. This was a person using it to his advantage against another faith, right? The Jewish community also began to thrive in southern Spain, but then you're going to see anti-Semitism start popping up in a lot of medieval Catholic communities. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the Crusades. And many Jewish people began to migrate or spread out, and this is, of course, known as a diaspora to other areas of Europe. So Catholic Church at the time, not the most accepting of other faiths. So it is important that we understand that. So also, though, another element of the Catholic Church is the growth of monasteries and convents, right? So monasteries and convents were a very important element of the Catholic Church, and understanding what they are and what they evolved into is very, very important. So monasteries and convents are these very large areas where nuns and monks would come together and dedicate their life to faith and study, right? They did a lot of amazing things. Monasteries and convents would provide health care for travelers, would house people that needed a home, would help local communities and things like that. But the biggest thing about them was that they were dedicated to certain ideas like labor, work, study, prayer, and trying to have a deeper understanding of the Bible. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas actually worked in a monastery where he began to translate the works of Aristotle, right? You've got several other ones like what's his name? There's not another one, not St. Thomas Aquinas, but there's another one with an A, and I can't remember what his name is. I'll have to ask Mr. Mathern. Now, so the big thing, though, is that they did a lot of positive things, but eventually monasteries and convent life needed to be regulated, right? So St. Benedict actually came up with this thing called Benedictine rules, right? So around the 6th century, to govern monastic life and also to govern the lives of priests, St. Benedict is going to actually adopt 3 rules that are believed to kind of govern the lives of people who work inside the church. And those 3 rules were poverty, as in we preach not for financial gain, but we preach to spread the word. 2, chastity, as in you dedicate your life to God, so you resist the temptations of other humans distracting you from that life, so you are chaste your entire life and you never get married. And 3rd, obedience, and usually obedience to the church leader, so obedience to the Pope and the leaders of the church. So these 3 rules are going to be very, very important for regulating the growth of monasteries, but they're going to get a little bit kind of out of whack a little bit later on when we get towards the Renaissance and things like that, right? Now, these monasteries would eventually house humongous large libraries, the very first ones that were ever seen in Europe. And then during the Middle Ages, they're going to grow into what's called universities, right? You need to highlight that right there, okay? These monasteries would grow into universities, the very first ones to ever pop up in Europe. The very, very first one was in 1065, I think. 1065 is the University of Bologna, right? It was actually in Italy. Later ones being the University of Oxford and the University of Paris, where all actually started as monasteries where monks and nuns would live their lives, have laborious works to connect to their entire prayer and practice, have vows of silence, but later on they turned into universities where people even came to practice law and learn other sciences and things like that. And this idea was actually a borrowed idea because the Muslims in southern Spain, because remember they were going through a golden age during this time period, inventing algebra, the number 0, all that stuff. They had universities already, and so the Catholics modeled their university off those Muslim ones that were actually down in southern Spain. This right here is an image of a Muslim university in southern Spain during this time period. And as you can see, it's very, very similar to that picture right here. So that right there is a monk teaching other priests how to actually practice certain ideas. And this right here is actually Muslims teaching one another in a university setting. Very, very similar. Just the kind of things they're wearing are a little bit different, right? Now, looking at this, though, you got to understand, last but not least, that church power began to grow just a little bit too rapidly, right? So in the early and high Middle Ages, when the church began its foundation of its preaching, the church power starts to grow really, really fast. And the church and popes begin to kind of accrue massive amounts of money very, very quickly. And usually whenever you accrue that much money, you're going to start getting corrupt politicians and people inside of your church, right? So this led to corruption and extreme concepts of punishment, right? So if you refused to pay tribute, or if hypothetically a king or somebody was going against a pope and refused to listen to them, popes would enact papal supremacy or papal suprematic authority, and they would do some things to punish people. Now, normal punishment was when somebody got kicked out of the church, right? And that was believed that you can't receive Christian sacraments or Christian burial, so you won't be able to actually ascend to heaven. That simple one is called excommunication, right? Now, then there was a political one where you're excommunicating entire towns or countries, right? So now that's what's known as an interdiction. So the motive behind that would be, oh, I'm going to excommunicate as a corrupt church leader. I would excommunicate one noble, by default excommunicating all of his land, which means that basically the noble and all the people that live where he lives are all destined to be like going to hell, which is a very, very aggressive concept. And usually what these religious leaders were trying to use it to their advantage was to inspire a revolt, right? So an interdiction is when you would excommunicate an entire town or village to punish a noble, right? Then you had some very extreme cases, and the most extreme cases were the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was a church court that tried to convict suspected heretics, right? Or people who would speak down on the church. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the Inquisition when I see you in class. I'm going to go ahead and let you go so you can enjoy your weekend, but I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.